Half-Life 2 Episode 3 and Half-Life 3 were two highly anticipated video games that never saw the light of day. They both would have continued the story of Half-Life following a major cliffhanger, but thanks to the release of a cache of concept art, we now have further insight into what those games might have been like. But first, taking a step back, Valve Software originally planned to follow up its groundbreaking video game Half-Life 2 with an expansion pack called Half-Life 2 Aftermath. But during development, it was decided to split that game up into 3 smaller episodes. Half-Life 2 Episode 2 was released a couple years later on October 10, 2007. With the game ending on a shocking cliffhanger and the promise of 3 episodes, fans of the series eagerly awaited Episode 3. But fans continued to wait, and that waiting turned into years, and then those years turned into over a decade. The excitement fizzled out as time went on. Even Valve seemed to quietly lose interest in the project over the years, and with no new information coming out about Half-Life 3, it seemed the franchise was dead. Former lead writer of the Half-Life series, Mark Laidlaw, eventually published a short story called Epistle 3 on his website in 2017. Now, this story was not officially endorsed by Valve in any way. It is not an official continuation of the Half-Life series. However, a lot of fans see it as a kind of spiritual successor. It's widely considered to be what Mark Laidlaw envisioned for Episode 3 before the greater company of Valve started to lose interest in the series. The story kind of has a weird spot in the fan base as being seen as the unofficial ending of the series, the unofficial continuation as well, and the resolution of a lot of loose plot points. As a matter of fact, that short story has inspired some fans to create their own versions of Episode 3, the most notable of which is the still in development Project Borealis. Now, Valve themselves did eventually continue the story of Half-Life on their own, sort of. Half-Life Alyx was released on March 23, 2020. This VR exclusive title was a continuation of the series in a sense. However, as a prequel, it didn't continue the story, though there were some flash-forward moments that did kind of play with the continuation of the timeline, but it was nothing really substantial like what we would have saw in Episode 3 or what Mark Laidlaw laid out in Epistle 3, and it certainly wasn't a continuation like Half-Life 3 was expected to be. So basically, it was a new Half-Life game, which was exciting, but it wasn't a continuation of the story that a lot of fans were kind of hoping for and expecting. Over the years, this over decade of waiting, we haven't gotten a whole lot of official information on what Episode 3 was going to be about, though little bits of information have come out over the years, giving a pretty good indication. That includes the earlier concept art that was leaked not long after Episode 2 was released. However, more recently, this cache of concept art is probably the most significant release of information related to Episode 3 that we have gotten in years. It comes courtesy of David McGreavy, who is a senior producer at 2K and a self-described Valve enthusiast. This guy is incredibly interesting. He is definitely someone that people who are a fan of Half-Life or just Valve in general should have on their radar. This guy basically collects Valve memorabilia, and he's been doing this for years. Being in the industry himself, he's made friends with people at Valve, and so when they're looking to get rid of something, clean out their desks, downsize their office, whatever it may be, instead of throwing that stuff out, he offers to buy it from them. And so he's collected a bunch of stuff over the years through this method, including this cache of concept art. Now, David first announced that he had all this concept art on April 24th. He put out a tweet basically saying that he's taking time to scan and archive this collection of art that he got. And that got people excited. There was other YouTubers, there was Twitter accounts that were like, oh, this is very interesting. And he posted 2 pictures of all this stuff kind of piled together. And so this was a pretty big deal. This was never before seen outside of Valve, never before seen art for a video game that never happened but has been highly anticipated for many years. Months later, more recently on August 28th, 2022, the account called Lambda Generation posted high-resolution scans of this concept art to their Twitter account with permission from David. Now, this is another Twitter account people should definitely follow if they're a fan of the Half-Life series. They're a great repository of news and information related to the games, so very much worth a follow. But what's really cool is there seems to be a lot more on the way. David wants to share higher quality versions of the concept art he already shared with us, but a particular note, that only represents a small fraction of what he was able to get, and he eventually wants to release more of it to us. When it comes to this concept art, he has about 50 pieces that he eventually wants to post online. He even noted that his entire Valve collection, so not just this cache of concept art, but his entire collection, numbers around 1,500 items, which he is trying to categorize and preserve digitally. And that is incredibly exciting. The pictures we already have are incredibly interesting. It's very fascinating to see kind of what Valve was envisioning for Episode 3 until that project slowly fizzled out, experienced this incredibly slow death. But, a collection of 50 pieces that could make their way online in super high quality, that is incredibly exciting. But back to the concept art we do have. There's a couple common themes we can pick out among most of them. Most of them show these expansive landscapes with usually silhouetted figures looking out across them. In a few of them, it's 3 silhouetted figures, possibly Gordon, Alex, and someone else. And in a couple of them, it's clearly Alex and Dog who are looking out across these expansive landscapes. They usually show debris. A couple of them look like they could possibly take place in the Arctic, which makes sense based on what we know about Episode 3, that it was supposed to take place in the Arctic and involved looking for the Borealis and deciding whether to use it as a weapon against the Combine or destroy it because it's too powerful. So a couple of them taking place in the Arctic makes sense. A couple of them look like they take place on the coastline or possibly the ocean bed, because we see a little bit of the ocean, but these massive vessel ships kind of resting on these cliff faces and stuff like that. And that seems to go along with the idea of the Combine draining the oceans. So in Half-Life 2, especially the Highway 17 chapters, there was definitely evidence of the Combine draining the oceans. The beaches were very long, there was docks in weird places, and ships in the sand. The ocean, there was definitely signs the ocean was receding in. We know from leaks of the beta version of the game that this actually ties into something that was going to be a big plot point, but was eventually cut, and that's the idea that the Combine was stripping Earth of its resources. So they originally had an air exchange, which was going to replace fresh air on Earth with toxic air, and they were going to be draining the oceans and a bunch of other stuff that had to do with basically strip mining Earth. So a lot of those plot points were removed from the game, but the physical evidence that the Combine were doing this is still there, and most notably that the ocean coastlines were receding quite significantly. So that's what it looks like is happening in these pictures. In a couple of the pictures, we see what looks like a citadel, which is quite interesting because we know that the citadel was destroyed at the end of Episode 1, so it's kind of a question of what's happening there. There's a few things that could be happening. One, we know based on Episode 3 that the Episode 3 might have had kind of a time travel component to it, so maybe it's the citadel that was destroyed. But I don't think that's the case because the time travel was more tied directly into traveling on the Borealis and more had to do with reality kind of shifting and stuff like that. I don't think it was going to be a physical, go back to a point in the past. It was more going to be seeing haunting images of the past kind of resonating through time and distorted reality type stuff. So I don't think that's it, but it is a possibility that is the City 17 Citadel, but not destroyed because of time travel. I think it's more likely that it's a different Citadel somewhere else on Earth, possibly in the Arctic. Now, the only Citadel we saw was, at least on Earth, because we get this small glimpse of the overworld on top of the Citadel, but the only one we saw on Earth was the City 17 Citadel, which got destroyed, but that doesn't mean that was the only Citadel on Earth, so there's a possibility that this was just a different Citadel somewhere else on Earth. So those were kind of the photos we saw. A lot of interesting things, a lot of details which we could speculate on and kind of connect with what we do know about what Episode 3 could have been like, but more so, they're very striking. They're actually very interesting pieces of art. You know, absent the game itself, which obviously makes them even more interesting and more exciting, they're just really good pieces of art. So that was the concept art we were able to get from this release. And it's very exciting to think that we may get more down the line, because this stuff was absolutely amazing to look through, and I highly recommend people go on the Lambda Generation Twitter page and check it out for themselves. I wanted to thank Lambda Generation for actually posting these pictures, and David McGreavy for finding them in the first place and sharing them with the community. It's a big, big gift to fellow Half-Life fans, and it was incredibly nice of him to share his personal collection with all of us who have been fascinated with Episode 3 and Half-Life 3 for years, to see what it might have looked like, to see the concept art of what they were envisioning for this game. And I can't wait to see what else they release, concept art or otherwise. It's just been absolutely great to look through. But anyways, thank you so much for joining me. I very much appreciate it and hope you have a great day.